This is the second part of the video where we look at doing intervention, especially with a short passage, by looking at it through the lens of question type. And so part one of the video covered vocab, the author's use of language, tone, and attitude, those two types of questions. So you can check that video out, but we're going to move on to our next type of question, which is the, look back questions and the inference questions. So look back is a term I came up with. And if anybody can think of a better way to call these, to talk about these questions, I'm all ears. Look back seems silly because you pretty much always have to look back at the passage, but this is the way that I have called the questions where you'll see words like according to the passage or the author states. And to me, what that means is that the answer is somewhere in the passage. Now, the answer is rarely worded the same in the passage as it is in the answer choice. That's the student's ability to read the idea and really understand what it means in different words. But we'll see the contrast with inference means the answer is really not in the passage. You have to really pull together the clues when you do inferences. With look back, you should be able to look back at the passage and actually point to something that gives away the answer. And that's why I call it a look back question. It's sort of an imperfect way to classify these questions, but I haven't found a better way. Again, I am always open to better suggestions. If some of you wordsmiths out there have a better way of referring to these kinds of questions, I would be all ears. So once again, I talked about this in my last video. On the short passage questions, I always have the students read the question before they read the passage to build their purpose for reading. I do say to them, like your teachers may tell you, this isn't the best strategy on STAR, this isn't the best strategy on SAT, it's not the best strategy on AP. That is fine. If that is your belief, I really do believe it's the best strategy on TSI. And you can't do it on all of the literary passage questions, which you'll see in a second, or not in a second, but you'll see in a subsequent video. But I do think it's really helpful because the passage is so short and it's the only question they're going to get on that passage. So I tell them to look for words like according to the passage or the author states, because that means the answer is in the passage. You just have to find it. The answer is going to be worded differently. Of course, it would be lovely if the words were exactly the same and all they had to do was play a game of matching, but we know that that's not what the TSI is trying to test. So I'm going to look at, I don't remember how many examples I have in here, but I have at least one to show you. So if you look at this question, I am again going to send myself away because I get in the way of the actual slideshow. Okay, oops, let me go back, excuse me. I am trying to get that thing to lift up and move. Okay, all right, here we go. Now we're in business. Okay, there we go. This is a typical look back question, starting with according to the passage. And so what I would do with the students is I would pre-read the question. Whether or not you want to pre-read the answers that go along with it, that's totally fine. I find that that's a lot of information for them to have in their heads, even for reading a short passage. So I just say we're looking for the reason that factory farms remain in business despite the suffering they cause the animals. I read that. If you want to go ahead, if you think it's a good idea to read the responses, sometimes I do it with the students, but often I just say, let's focus on what the question's asking. And so what I talk to them about is, and then this is a good one for us to do elimination on. So I'll start with that. I'll say, do you see anything in this passage? Because it says according to the passage. Do you see anything in the passage that has anything to do with politicians? Well, no. Get rid of it. You will find those answers where you don't even know why they're there because the passage has not mentioned it at all. But I am telling you, people will come at this question with their own experience and they may think, yeah, politicians suck, and they're going to pick that answer. So I always warn them that if it's not in the passage, then you got to get rid of it. It doesn't matter what you personally think. Same thing, there's nothing mentioned about local organic farms, so we know we can get rid of that one. The third choice is one that a lot of students are going to be attracted to because they think that themselves. Maybe you have some real animal lovers and they're like, people don't care about animals. And very often they bring their own experiences to the reading. And that is fantastic unless you're talking about testing. In that case, they sort of have to check those experiences at the door. So if they think that people lack compassion for animals, that is absolutely a valid point of view for them to have, but it's not mentioned in the passage. And this very specifically says, according to the passage. So of course, the correct choice is going to be, okay, so these two are not discussed in the passage. So I would definitely point that out to them, that these two answers are not discussed in the passage, that the correct answer is going to be that fourth choice and that last sentence. So if a student does not come to that answer, I would say if they're doing it through the chat and they're giving me wrong answers, I'll tell that student, I'll message them, please go ahead and reread the last sentence and then reconsider your choices, because the last sentence is another way of saying choice D. This one's actually a pretty easy one if they do their reading. But again, I think sometimes students approach these questions not just from a place of what's actually written, but what their own opinion on the topic is. I tell you, if you ever give them a short passage about homework, and they will want to pick the one that says people shouldn't give so much homework, even if it has nothing to do with what the passage says. So consider that too when you're doing some kind of testing intervention, is that oftentimes the students bring their own experiences to it. And they have to be able to separate from what they think and what they feel and what their heart says and what the passage says. And to know that those are both valid ways to respond to a reading, but on the test, you want to respond to what the passage actually says. And so understanding kind of the psychology brought to the test by the students will also help them avoid wrong answers, because trust me, the test makers consider that psychology when they write these questions. Okay, so here comes the big one, the inference question. And I kind of like to teach these alongside the main idea questions. I've started doing that recently because I think that inference questions, you can kind of draw a contrast between them, because with the look back questions, the answer is in the passage. Of the inference, the answer is not in the passage, but there is still, how do I want to say this? There's still foundation for it in the text. And that's why if you look at this, you will see that highlighted, because that's the one thing that I think of when I'm doing the questions, because I didn't always used to get these questions right. I don't know if I'm the only one that sometimes misses multiple choice, even as a very experienced English teacher. But I have come to realize that when I get it down to 2 or 3 choices, I really have to ask myself, what's a conclusion that I can reasonably get to from what's presented? Because what I find, and you guys might want to take a look at number 4, because if you want to understand why students are missing them, you have to understand what they're attracted to. There's always going to be an answer choice that the passage says the opposite, always. There's always going to be a couple of choices, 1 or 2 choices, where you can't get to that conclusion based on the evidence presented. That it's kind of a wild theory. And I can tell you that as a test taker, I'm always attracted to those choices because I'm like, it's so crazy, it just might be true. So that's one thing I'm always telling them to look out for. And so when I have a student pick a wrong choice, I'll say that has no foundation in the text. Go back to the text and see something that's actually, you can actually get to from the text. The author doesn't even touch on that in the text. So you've got to pick a different one. So that's where those wrong choices will sometimes be. And if you ever want to write your own passages, make sure you use those wrong choices so the kids have experience with seeing that. I believe that inference questions are sort of made for elimination strategies, that unless they're really confident on the answer, that using those elimination strategies with them is a good way to get them to the correct answer. So this is a good one to look at. It'll be, so this one has to do with the NFL. And of course, I know I'm going through this kind of quickly because you're not actually students and I'm not actually getting you ready for a test. But you can always pause it and read it and try to do the question on your own. I should have probably mentioned that earlier. But what does the author imply in the passage? So I've taught them, of course, to always pre-read the question. So now they know they're looking for an answer that is not directly stated in the passage, even with different words. That they're looking for having to draw a conclusion that you can reasonably get to from the text. So this one I think works really well because there are times when I'm doing TSI questions and I don't see an answer that I think is like glaringly right. I see a lot of answers that are kind of like problematic. So that's when I can sometimes eliminate my way to a right choice. And this might be a good question to do that with. So we look at this one, we read the passage, and then we go to the part where we sort of talk about And I mentioned to them, we know this is point to the imply word. We know it's a inference question. We know the question's not going to be directly stated and that we're going to have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to get to the answer, but not too much mental gymnastics. So I'll talk about, we'll sort of go through and we'll say how we can eliminate these. So this one is an example of something they throw in there that has no foundation in the text. There's nothing in the text that says that even hints at that. So we would have to eliminate that one. Now, some students might pick it if they just saw the movie by Will Smith. They might be like, I saw the movie. I know that's what the NFL tried to do. But again, that's coming at it with their own personal opinion and not what's in the text. The rate of Alzheimer's is not any different. The passage actually states the opposite. And then we get down to the two. And then at that point, what I point out about the second choice is that we're solely to blame for the diseases suffered. There's not enough information in the text to get there. But yeah, the first one, even though it's not stated, that's what he's saying. He's saying, well, these people probably get concussions because they get knocked around a lot playing football. And that's what he's implying, is that because of the nature of football, because of how the sport is played, that those injuries are probably connected to that part of football. So that would mean for them that the first choice is correct. So it's kind of hard. Like, these are the questions that are a little more difficult, I think, and these are the questions that I want them to spend the time on. If they can answer other questions like the vocabulary questions a little bit more quickly, I'm okay with that. So that's so that they can spend a little bit more time, do the elimination, and do the work on the questions they need to. Here's another inference one that you can take a look at. And this one is more difficult than the football one because globalization is not something that they have any experience in. So they have to read a little bit more carefully. What conclusion can be drawn from the passage? I think it's important for them to see that sometimes the way the questions asked might be a little bit different, but the skills to get there is the same. We're always going to be on the lookout for answers that are not mentioned at all in the passage, and we're also going to be on the lookout for the passage saying the opposite. So again, I think inference questions are a great time to coach the strategy of elimination. I don't think you always need to eliminate. I think sometimes like over teaching that skill or having students always do that makes them overthink questions that they could otherwise get right pretty easily. So what I might do with this one is, again, I would get them to, they may not know what varied economic means is, so I might help them by going through and explaining that and defining that for them. I will point out to them that this is not discussed in the passage, and I would say that these two choices, the passage actually says the opposite, and then I would point out that I would show them where the answer is. Here's how it benefits poorer countries, here's how it benefits richer countries, and we would do that as a talk aloud to get them to realize that that's the correct response. Even though it's not stated in the passage, that's what they're basically saying. That's kind of the overall conclusion. So, okay, that is the next two types of questions. The inference questions, I found personally for me that I started to see the patterns when I did a bunch of them. When I started to really, and I start to see that with students, that like once you say to them and you explain to them why it's wrong, you say that answer is not discussed in the passage, or that's something that's different. And once you tell them that there will be responses, the distractor choices will fall into those different categories. And that's the question that I always ask them to return to is, which one has foundation in the text? Which one can you get to from the information presented in the text? And I'm not saying that's always going to set off the light bulb for them, but that when they hear that enough, they start to ask themselves those questions when they encounter these really more difficult inference. And again, I think that the strategy of elimination works very well with inference questions. Okay, so that's the second part of the video. Please let me know if you have any questions. And the third part of the video will cover author's craft, primary purpose, main idea.